Now, we talk about these days often about the political class. We all know, I think, we've got a good sense of what that is referring to. The idea that we have this sort of amorphous group of elected politicians, officials, people running agencies, all the sort of people who are part of the machine of government, who seem to live in a strange bubble which is completely cut off from the lives of most of us and from the real world. And a very good example of that is what I want to talk about for the rest of my remarks this evening, which is something that for the last year, he holds up book again. I wonder why I've been writing this book about. It's only come out this week. In fact, it hasn't properly been published yet, so forgive me for referring to it. But in 12 days' time, we will come to the first anniversary of one of the most extraordinary scenes that has ever unfolded in the Palace of Westminster. And as it happens, there's one person here, Sammy Wilson, MP, who was present and played some part in this extraordinary spectacle. The government had put to Parliament, by far, far and far away, the most expensive piece of legislation ever presented to Parliament. It's a thing called the Climate Change Bill. How many people in this room have heard of the Climate Change Act? Can you put up your hands? Yeah, pretty clued up audience. Now, the point about the Climate Change Act is that it has laid down as statute that from now until 2050, or between now and 2050, we have to cut our carbon dioxide emissions, CO2 emissions, by well over 80%. There is no conceivable way, short of a technological revolution which no one's yet begun to imagine, there is no way that this target can be achieved without closing down most of our industrial economy, clearing cars off the roads. It would involve a change in our way of life that is literally unimaginable. Even the government admitted that when they put this bill before the House of Commons, the benefits of it were going to be far outweighed by 2 to 1 by the costs. So you would have thought it's not exactly the bargain of the century. They later revised their figures to show that it's going to cost us, between now and 2050, £18 billion every year, which even these days is still quite a lot of money. Now, perhaps the most astonishing thing about this was that for 6 hours the House of Commons debated this bill, and only 2 MPs questioned the reason for it, the purpose of it. A truly insane measure. Yatta, yatta, yatta. They went on for 6 hours, and only 2 MPs, one of whom is with us in this room, Sammy Wilson. When the debate ended, the MPs trooped into the lobbies. 463 from all parties voted for it. Only 3 MPs voted against it, including Sammy Wilson. And just before the debate ended, Peter Lilly MP, who was one of the others who voted against it, drew the attention of the speaker to the fact that outside the Palace of Westminster, snow was falling. For the first time in October in London for 74 years. As I observed at the time, who says that God hasn't got a sense of humour? Now, I keep on referring to this book. I wonder why. It's a book about global warming. I'll give you the title and the publisher later. There have been lots of books about global warming, most of them stupefyingly boring. 1 or 2 of them are quite good. But where the book that I've been writing for the last year differs from the others is it's the first time that someone actually sat down to say, how on earth have we arrived at this position? What I've tried to do is to tell the whole story from the beginning up to the present day of what this whole extraordinary scare is about. Both the science and then the political response to it. Now, it's a story which has unfolded through three stages. It all began back in the 1970s when some of you are old enough to remember, like me, that temperatures, world temperatures, have been falling for 30 years. So a number of scientists suddenly woke up to this and they said, hang on, if it goes on like this, we're going to have a new ice age. Yes, we remember it well. And they wrote books about it, and they had conferences, and they wrote papers. And scarcely had they got the scare about the new ice age off the ground, then temperatures started to rise again. And again, it took a few years, and initially quite a small number of scientists said, hang on, if temperature's going up, what happens if they go up? And furthermore, we know why. Because there was a couple of scientists who were right at the heart of this, who'd already cottoned on to the fact that there might be a connection between temperatures rising and the fact that CO2 levels in the atmosphere are also rising. So the firm belief of a few scientists, let me just refresh my memory as to where I've got to in the story. It's a rather complicated story, so I've had to write most of it out. Yeah, the point is that in 1988, that small group of scientists who were totally convinced that CO2 rising caused temperatures to rise, they were headed by an Englishman, funnily enough, or Welshman to be fair. Welsh people here, I'm sorry to be racist. Dr. John Houghton was head of the UK Met Office, and he was one of the two absolutely key figures who was totally convinced by the CO2 theory, and he and a Swedish meteorologist called Bert Bolin, who Roger Helmer will have heard of, but I suspect nobody else in this room, they set up a thing. They got some political support. They were good at, in fact, Houghton had the support of Mrs. Thatcher, who briefly, but not, you'll be pleased to hear, forever, was swayed by this idea that CO2 and greenhouse gases and rising temperatures are linked. So in November 1988, they went off to Geneva and they set up a thing called the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we've all heard of, the IPCC. Yep. Very important and influential body, as we all know. Now, the IPCC, it's very important to realize, we've often been told it's 2,500 of the world's top climate scientists all agree, consensus and all that. Actually, when you look at the facts, as I've explained in my book, the number of scientists at the heart of it, running it, led at that time by Houghton, who was in charge of all the science, they were already totally convinced that CO2 led to rising temperatures, and the proof of it, they found, was in their computer models, very expensive computer models, costing millions of pounds, which were programmed to show that if CO2 rose, temperatures rose. Okay? So they've got their computer models, which seem to prove the point, and the IPCC, from that time on, became the central player in this whole astonishing, sad story. With remarkable speed, once the IPCC had got going, produced its first report, they won over many of the world's politicians, led by, right from the start, above all, the European Union, of which Roger Helmer is a distinguished servant. Is that right? The point being that what is really extraordinary about this story is the speed with which they managed to get this show off the road. They were helped enormously by the fact that a big scare was launched in America by someone called Dr. James Hansen, who's one of the real villains of this story, appearing before the Senate. And the media absolutely loved the idea that the world was about to come to an end because of CO2 rising, as indeed did all the environmental lobby groups who were a bit short of something to agitate about because the Cold War was ending, the nuclear threat was disappearing, so Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and all those people piled in, and immediately climate change, global warming, became the top of their agenda. Within 4 years, we saw this thing called the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit, which was an amazing, extraordinary occasion, 20,000 activists poured into Rio. 108 members of heads of state and prime ministers.